For those who crave more than just reading headlines in their social media feeds.
People need to wake up.
Today's News Talk, TNT.
And welcome back to the Patrick Henningsen Show with me, Basil Valentine. Today, Tuesday, the 6th of August. I'm delighted to say I'm joined on the line by Heiko Khoo, who was the Workers' Party candidate for Putney in the last election, is a regular speaker at Speaker's Corner, taking advantage of what we hope and believe is still the right to freedom of speech in Britain, although it's very much under threat. And it's particularly under threat in the current febrile atmosphere, is the only way to describe it. Elon Musk has joined in saying there's going to be a civil war in Britain. Various leaders on the right saying, I told you so, that underlying racial and religious tensions in Britain have not been addressed for decades. And now we see them spitting out into violence on the street. The government's only response, of course, is to lock everybody up, describing it as far-right thuggery, which on the face of it, it is. But we've got to get to the root of the problem, or it's not going to go away. Heiko, Elon Musk says there'll be civil war. I think he's being over-dramatic, but these are without doubt the most troubling scenes we've seen on the streets of Britain. Effectively, in terms of racial conflict and violence, since the start of immigration from what we used to call the new Commonwealth countries, that is South Asia and the West Indies, in the years after the Second World War.
Yes, that's certainly true. The tensions are quite deep-rooted, primarily because the long economic crisis following 2008 has exacerbated the tensions and divisions within society between the indigenous working classes, particularly in what used to be called the Red Belt, which turned blue under Brexit, and the migration of relatively large numbers of people from the Indian subcontinent, and also smaller numbers, but of course it's become a major focus of people coming on boats from Calais. And so that's the sort of the background, and the tensions have been rising for quite a long period of time. And the economic collapse of many of these cities and the life in these cities has exacerbated the tensions to the point where they've spilt over onto the streets and been able to be used by Tommy Robinson and many of his sympathizers as a scapegoat or as a lightning rod, if you like, for the tensions that have emerged, and to focus this on race, ethnicity, and religion in particular, is the central crux of what this layer of political agitators have been promoting.
Indeed. I mean, it's worth noting from the religious/racial point of view that most asylum seekers coming by boat to the United Kingdom come from North Africa and the Middle East. They're not South Asian racially, although there are Bangladeshis and Pakistanis that come that way. People arriving by boat as asylum seekers across the Channel tend to be coming from countries like Albania, Iraq, Afghanistan, and North Africa as well, but they are predominantly Muslims. Now, Robinson in particular, utterly reprehensible figure, his target has always been Muslims because he says they don't integrate with the rest of British society, British culture, and that they plan to take over. And in that respect, he's been emboldened, or rather activated perhaps, by those over in the Middle East. The Israeli regime, he may indeed even be an asset of theirs, to try and link the Palestinian struggle for national liberation, human rights, sovereignty and peace with British indigenous peoples' difficulties, should we say, real or imagined, with Muslim arrivals into Britain. Now, that's fundamentally specious and mendacious nonsense, but it seems to be having some effect, Heiko.
Yes, since October the 7th, the demonstrations in London in sympathy with the Palestinian cause and opposing the slaughter of Palestinian children by the thousand and Palestinian women by the thousand, as well as Palestinian fighters and Palestinian civilians in Gaza, has been used as an excuse, or better said, whipped up into a hysteria that the Palestinian marches in London, or pro-Palestinian marches in London, are somehow terrorist marches. And this, of course, was played to by the establishment in Britain as well, who are very much in hock to the Israel lobby and the Zionist lobby. Both Keir Starmer, many of his key financiers, individual financiers for Keir Starmer, the Conservative Party, and Tommy Robinson are all very closely aligned with the Israel lobby. Nigel Farage is a supporter of Israel. And so there's a sort of unanimity that Israel can do whatever it likes and slaughter whoever it likes. And those who protest against it are demonized and smeared as supporters of Hamas or supporters of terrorism. And yet the terroristic attacks that are happening every single day, and now escalating to the point of the possibility of a regional or wider war, in which Britain and America are being dragged into, and which the European countries fully support, is, if you like, dovetailing with this whipping up of hatred against Muslims in Britain, based on, associations which are completely false. I mean, it's not migrants arriving in Britain who are essentially, Tommy Robinson has got a campaign against Pakistanis in Britain.
Yes.
Based on the experience of grooming gangs which have been identified amongst a criminal element within the Pakistani community in some parts, Rotherham and elsewhere, and that is constantly used and played upon to raise primeval fears amongst the British population that their daughters are being raped and plundered. I watched a number of the videos by Tommy Robinson where he's screaming and shouting constantly about Muslims raping their way through Britain. And then, is your daughter next? This is the argument. And despite the fact that there are terrible crimes have been committed by some of these grooming gangs, some of whom happen to be Pakistani, and there is a problem with sections of that community who do that type of thing. And it's nothing to do with Islam. It's certainly nothing to do with God-fearing Muslims who, abhor that type of behavior. And so, it's a whipping up of hatred in which completely false narratives being spread around.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you make a very good point. Obviously, Islam does not condone the raping of children in any way, shape or form. But I think the establishment and the corporate media have exacerbated the problem because in league with the police, we weren't allowed to know about these crimes. And we can't have a debate about what's going on in society if certain events are covered up. Surely it would have been much better to be completely honest about what has been happening in Rochdale, Rotherham, and the other northern towns where you're right. We can't shy away from the fact that there were groups of Pakistani men grooming underage girls and using them for sexual purposes. I don't think the prison sentences that they were handed were anything like long enough, quite frankly. Most of them probably be out in a few years' time. And I think they regarded it all as a bit of a joke. And they certainly took advantage of the fact that they felt they were a protected minority and that the police even left them alone and did not respond to complaints and accusations because they didn't want to stir up racial tensions. Surely that's only made things worse, Heiko.
Yes, I would agree, but you've got to remember that the Catholic Church was heavily involved in the abuse of children for decades. Public schools were heavily involved in the abuse of children for decades. And those things came out after the event and had been covered up by all the institutional players at that time as well. Now, that's not to negate the arguments about the grooming gangs there, connecting that with the politically correct attitude that you don't want to stir up racial tensions, which is all true. But I do think that has to be borne in mind. And again, Tommy Robinson talks a lot about terrorism and connecting the terrorism, the religion, and the grooming gangs. Well, he's a partly Irish stock. The Irish, when I was a child, were accused, and your time as well, were accused of being terrorists, and did carry out terrorist acts. The Catholic Church was responsible for vast numbers of child abuse cases, with huge settlements eventually made in the United States, in Ireland, and in Britain, and and they were demonized for their religion as well. So it's and then again, the other side to it is, of course, is that there is the history of British imperialism. A lot of people don't like to talk about that, but if you don't understand the history of British imperialism, you would never understand why so many people from the Indian subcontinent are coming to Britain or have settled in Britain, established themselves in Britain.
Yeah, of course, the Roman Catholic Church in Ireland has all but disintegrated from the high water mark of Pope John Paul II and a sort of Catholic revival towards the end of the 20th century. The last 25 years since all those scandals started coming to light, and they are numerous. That's seen, the collapse of traditional Roman Catholic faith in Ireland. Church-going numbers are, a tiny fraction of what they were even relatively recently. We're going to take a short break now. When we come back, so much more to unpack on this subject, including the implications for freedom of speech here in Great Britain. We'll be right back.
Political commentator and investigative journalist. You're with Patrick Henningsen on today's News Talk, TNT.
And welcome back to today's programme with me, Basil Valentine, sitting in for Patrick Henningsen. Today, Tuesday, the 6th of August. Anne McElvoy writes in the Evening Standard, Heiko, we don't know much yet about Starmer's view on what, beyond the culpable social media promotion of false narratives about the Southport killing spree and pent-up summer anger, is to blame, but it will affect his premiership in the way of unexpected eruptions which define prime ministerial fates. It is a lot easier to rehearse, she says, the diversity is vibrant line of argument than it is to be open about sporadic discords which come with that diversity. And I think she's onto something there, because it seems that we have to look at society as a whole, is what I'm trying to say. And obviously everybody abhors the violence, but you can't treat it in isolation from what's been happened to Britain over the last 50 years. Of course, I'm not condoning the violence in any way, shape or form, but the rioters feel they've been unheard by metropolitan political elites, of which Keir Starmer is absolutely typical.
Yeah, just to come back on the point before the break, and that is the decline of the Catholic religion and of the Anglican religion, which is even more precipitous in Britain, has been contrasted with the big rise or significant rise in the number of people who believe in Islam. And that's connected with the global process, the role of Israel, and also the sentiment that the Muslim people are, if you like, an oppressed force internationally by the major powers, the United States, Israel, and NATO and the Western alliances. And the consequence of that isn't the economic power in the world. The consequence of that is that an identity has been created within British society, within Muslim communities, that they are part of that global, if you like, discontent against British imperialism and against Western imperialism, and that they don't feel part of the West. And so a sort of more militant faction of Islam has begun to manifest itself amongst a layer of the Muslim youth. And you can see that in the Defence League operations which have happened in the last few days, where feeling that they should show their strength against the Tommy Robinson supporters and defend the mosques and so on, that they put on balaclavas and tool themselves up and create some sort of defensive organization. And so the consequence of that is that the divisions open up even more. And people say, oh, there's two-tier policing. They're allowed to do that, and we're not allowed to do that. Coming back to the issue of discord, to the issue of, from the article you just mentioned, rehearsing diversity and so on. I think Keir Starmer is going to use this, or is using this, as his means to show that he's a strong man, because his very nature is this bureaucratic machinery, the CPS, the machinery of surveillance, control, the MI5. That's where he feels at home, in that type of ambient. He's not a speaker. He can't communicate well with people, but he bureaucratically can maneuver. Now, of course, whether this is going to work is another question, because we've already got, just before this broke out, we had the crisis in the prisons, where lots of people, they were talking about releasing a lot of people who've been put on indefinite prison sentences. And now the prisons are supposed to be occupied with hundreds and hundreds of more people. And funnily enough, just after the election in Britain, I went up to Blackburn, where Craig Murray stood, and he got a reasonable vote. And Adnan, I think his name Hussein, got elected as the candidate for Blackburn. And in that area, what was I going to say? So I lost my train of thought.
All right, you were up in Blackburn supporting Craig Murray. And in that area, I mean, obviously, to have elected Adnan, we must be talking about pretty much a majority Muslim population there by now. Am I exaggerating?
It's about 45% there. It's about 45%. Right. And the Adnan and his community were sort of connected in with networks, connected to the mosques and connected to certain business interests. And there was a split in the vote, because Craig Murray was a white man stood, and he had more the political Islam group, but Adnan had more the sort of interconnected associations, which perhaps previously would have gone to the Labour Party and shifted against the Labour Party in that election. Yes. And so there are sort of tribal, and then there are sort of layers of young people who are more political, and then other layers who are tied in with religious organizations and institutions that have emerged as a result of having an economy in which 45% of the population are tied to the Indian subcontinent, in particular to Pakistan.
And with respect to that, the angry mob. The point that they're trying to make is that Muslims in Britain are not integrated in the rest of society and think and act entirely along lines that are supportive of their own community and their own community leaders. In other words, in any given political situation, they will vote themselves on racial and religious lines, whereas the rest of us might vote on ideology. Do you think that's a fair comment?
I think historically, the Muslim community was very closely tied to the Labour Party. And despite the fact the Labour Party was, even under Jeremy Corbyn, they were voting Labour. So it wasn't about PC issues. It wasn't about religion per se. It's just they felt that they felt more of an affinity to the poor and the working classes. And that, I think, is splintering as a consequence of global affairs, which are affecting the consciousness of these young people far more than they are the consciousness of young white people at the moment. And the consequence of that is they feel, they're going out on the protest against Tommy Robinson supporters carrying Palestine flags. Well, the British protesters, or the white protesters, better said, going out and protesting, or mostly white, it's not only white, but mostly white protesters. They might carry the George flag, but they won't be carrying the Israel flag, although some of them are of that inclination. The more politically orientated of them, like Tommy Robinson, are definitely Zionist supporting Israel, and it's almost like, you implied this at the beginning. It's almost like they are whipping this up to galvanize support in Britain in favor of Israel and against the Palestinians. It's almost like that was the case. So somehow you have all this intermeshing of the indigenous versus the immigrant Muslim communities, and then that's intermeshed with these global issues. And it's very difficult, of course, for people to grasp that's actually a large part of what's going on, both in terms of the migration, but also in terms of the politics.
Absolutely. I mean, I've had it suggested even that the current unrest is Israel punishing the incoming Starmer government for all his support for genocide and slavish devotion to Zionism, because Britain withdrew its objections to the ICC's jurisdiction over Netanyahu and Gallant, and is on the brink of imposing arms embargoes to Israel. So as a result, Israel has activated its assets in the UK to cause this trouble. I can't verify that, of course, but that's what some more conspiratorially minded people are saying. Ironically, Hope Not Hate led a vicious smear campaign against George Galloway in Rochdale, making all sorts of mendacious claims about him, which have led George to take a file to Greater Manchester Police alleging irregularities with the general election, because, of course, he lost his seat, and he's got all sorts of reasons why he believes it should be rerun, the election should be rerun. But Hope Not Hate were at the centre of that smear campaign, basically acting on behalf of the Israelis. And yet now, Joe Mulhall, the director of research at Hope Not Hate, says it's aware of a list that has circulated on social media over the last 48 hours, which consists of the purported names and locations of various offices relating to immigration and asylum services around the country, a hit list of aspirational targets that call for action. Well, if Hope Not Hate was so concerned about all this, why didn't they leave George Galloway alone?
Yeah, Hope Not Hate is an insidious organization, like the general politically correct orientation of a large number of the so-called liberal elite. And you have to understand this in context of the tyranny that was imposed on the world during the lockdown period and the whole COVID crisis, in which the suppression of information, the suppression of free speech was used to promote experimental vaccinations, which were extremely dangerous, and it's been well recorded by all sorts of different institutions now, and organizations and individuals, and to impose the most tyrannical type of regime on the entire planet in modern times. And so that was the context, the background. And by the way, this guy, when people started talking about the guy who, the young boy who killed these children, if there's a mental issue here, you got to remember about a third of young people during the coronavirus crisis were having some desperate mental crisis, and many young people felt they might commit suicide. And it's in that type of context that you have to understand the individual outbreaks of insanity which occur and result in these type of killings, and then of course they're not isolated. Killings happen all around the world, and generally the extremity of mental instability that leads to shootings, killings, stabbings, this type of thing, by individual like lunatics, if you like, or people deranged, twisted, moved to this kind of madness, whether it be Muslims or whether it be, anyone else, or Breivik in Norway, or there was a Syrian last year in France who killed a load of children. And he screamed out when he went in to go and kill them, he shouted out, God, Jesus is king. And so, it's nothing to do per se with the religion, but I think that the sort of outbreaks of insanity have a social cause. It doesn't mean every outbreak of insanity, but the manifestations of these type of things have a social cause. Just one thing that came to my mind earlier when you were talking was when I first went to the United States and went to Philadelphia, I was surprised at how divided the communities were there. And I'd not seen that in Britain. There was one area of Philadelphia that's entirely black, or almost entirely black, another area entirely Irish, another area entirely Latino. And I hadn't really seen that in Britain before. Now, it is true that in Blackburn, that is how it is there. You do have, this one area which I visited, which is almost entirely Muslim, and you can drive 5-10 minutes down the road and it's almost entirely white. And there are parts of London a bit like that, but there's a bit of in London, it's much more integrated and mixed together. And I think that's one of the reasons why you haven't seen these outbreaks of conflict in London. And I don't think they would get that support in London. The Tommy Robinson supporters, they might be able to gather for a demonstration, but the people they gather together on the demonstration are more questioning. I think some of these people have been dragged along to those demonstrations around the issue of free speech, around the issue of the anti-lockdown movement, around the issue of politically correct manipulation of psychology, around the issue of the whole trans debate and all this sort of thing. It was Tommy Robinson managed to draw those people together on that demonstration a couple of weeks ago in a way he hadn't done before. These were souls who had been, if you like, looking for a new home after the collapse of the anti-lockdown with what used to be called the freedom movement.
Yes, I mean, I wouldn't want to sort of lump the freedom movement in with Robinson's rabble, but I do think maybe worth mentioning the fact that 5 million people voted Reform and they only got 5 seats. That Britain's electoral system means that people feel they aren't represented in Parliament. We've got to leave it there. Heiko, great to talk to you, and we'll speak again very.
Replay of this hour. Go to